The evening light faded as Kat pulled out of the college parking lot, heading down the long, familiar highway toward home. She rubbed her tired eyes, the day's stress still weighing heavily on her shoulders. It had been another exhausting day of classes, and all she wanted was the comfort of her bed. Her old car hummed quietly as she picked up speed, the tires humming over the cracked asphalt. The highway stretched ahead of her, endless and empty, framed by tall, dark trees on either side that seemed to block out the last of the fading daylight. As she drove, her mind wandered, thinking of the argument she'd had with her parents that morning. They were worried about her, she knew that. But the constant nagging about her grades, her future, it was suffocating. Living at home was supposed to make things easier, but lately, it felt like a prison. Still, it was better than the alternative, struggling to afford rent and juggling 2 jobs while attending college. This was the compromise she'd made, but the cost felt higher every day. By the time she reached the small parking lot near her house, the sky was a deep navy, the last traces of light disappearing behind the trees. She turned off the engine and sighed, sinking into the quiet that filled the car. For a moment, she sat there, staring blankly at the dashboard, her mind elsewhere. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure. He stood at the far edge of the parking lot, just beyond the reach of the lone streetlight. A man. Tall and still, his face hidden in the shadows. Kat's heart gave a small jolt. She hadn't seen anyone when she pulled in, and the lot was usually empty at this time of night. Her fingers tightened around the steering wheel, eyes locked on the figure. He wasn't moving, just standing there, watching her. For a few moments, neither of them moved. Then, with a shake of her head, she broke her gaze. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Maybe he was just a neighbor she hadn't noticed before, or a pedestrian passing by. She grabbed her bag and stepped out of the car, but when she glanced back, the man was gone. She shivered, pulling her jacket tighter around herself. The air seemed colder than usual. Without looking back again, Kat hurried to the front door, her footsteps quick and light against the gravel. As she locked the door behind her, the feeling of being watched lingered, creeping up her spine long after the house fell silent. The next day passed in a blur of lectures, group projects, and crammed-in study sessions. By the time Kat left campus, it was already late, the sun dipping below the horizon. She hadn't intended to stay this long, but an upcoming exam had kept her in the library much later than usual. Now, she regretted it. The drive home felt different tonight. The familiar road, normally a quiet, solitary stretch, felt unnervingly still. The shadows cast by the trees seemed darker, the road narrower, as if the night itself was closing in around her. Kat turned on the radio, hoping the music would chase away the silence, but the static was worse than usual. After a few failed attempts to find a station, she gave up, leaving only the hum of the engine to keep her company. As she pulled into the parking lot, her stomach tightened. The man was there again. He stood in almost the same spot as before, but this time he was closer, just within the dim glow of the streetlight. Kat's breath hitched as she slowed the car, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. There were no other cars, no signs of movement, just him, watching. She didn't want to get out of the car. Her mind raced through scenarios. What if he followed her? What if he was dangerous? But she couldn't sit there all night. With a deep breath, she gathered her things and stepped out, trying to ignore the heavy weight of his stare. This time, she didn't look directly at him. She kept her head down, walking quickly toward the house. As she reached the door, she couldn't help it. She glanced back. The man hadn't moved. He was still standing there, just watching, like he was waiting for something. Kat's fingers fumbled with the keys, and after what felt like an eternity, she managed to unlock the door and slip inside. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and it took a long time for her to calm down. Even then, the image of the man standing there lingered in her mind, unsettling her in a way she couldn't quite explain. 2 nights later, after another argument with her parents, Kat decided to take a walk. She needed to clear her head, to breathe. The argument had been the same as always, her parents pushing her about school, her future, their constant worry hanging over her like a cloud. She couldn't take it anymore. The night was cold and quiet as she walked down the road toward the small convenience store on the corner. The sky was thick with clouds, blotting out the stars, and the streetlights flickered weakly. By the time she left the store, her mood hadn't improved, but at least the fresh air had helped clear her mind. As she walked back toward the house, a sound caught her attention, soft footsteps behind her, barely audible over the wind. Kat's heart skipped. She turned her head slightly, trying to glimpse the source of the sound without being obvious. The man was following her. He was keeping a careful distance, just far enough behind that it wasn't clear if he was deliberately trailing her or just walking the same path. But Kat knew. She quickened her pace, her heart racing. The footsteps grew louder. Her house was in sight now, just a few more minutes. She could make it. But as she neared the driveway, the footsteps stopped. Kat dared a glance over her shoulder. The man stood in the middle of the street, his figure obscured by the thick fog that had begun to roll in from the highway. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, he spoke. "It's not me you should fear. It's the road." His voice was low, barely above a whisper, but it sent a chill through Kat's body. She froze, the words echoing in her mind. Before she could respond, before she could even process what he'd said, he was gone, swallowed by the fog. The next day, Kat couldn't shake the man's words from her mind. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, a random creep trying to scare her. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. Something about his tone, his expression, had been so final. Like a warning. On the drive to campus that evening, her unease only grew. The road felt strange today, the trees casting long, unnatural shadows over the cracked pavement. She turned up the radio, hoping for some distraction, but all she got was static. Annoyed, she fiddled with the dials, but nothing changed. The static continued, a low, hissing sound that seemed to grow louder the further she drove. And then, without warning, her car sputtered. The engine coughed once, then twice, before the car jerked to a sudden stop. "What the hell?" Kat muttered, her heart skipping a beat. She pressed her foot down on the gas, but the car didn't respond. The headlights flickered, and the dashboard lights dimmed. The static on the radio grew louder, and beneath it, she could swear she heard whispers, soft, unintelligible, but there. Panic surged through her, but just as quickly as it had died, the car roared back to life. The lights brightened, the radio cleared, and she was moving again. Her heart pounded in her chest as she sped the rest of the way to campus, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. But what? By the time Kat returned home that night, her nerves were shot. The strange behavior of the car, the whispers in the radio, it all felt connected somehow. And then there was the man's warning. She couldn't stop thinking about it. As she pulled into the parking lot, her stomach clenched. The man was there again. This time, he was standing directly in her path, his dark silhouette illuminated by the weak streetlight. Kat's heart raced as she slowed the car to a stop. She wanted to hit the gas and get out of there, but something held her back. A strange sense of inevitability. He was closer now, so close that she could see the lines of his face, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Slowly, he approached the car. Kat's breath caught in her throat, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so hard they hurt. He stopped just a few feet from her window, his hand raised in a gesture that was almost pleading. "You need to leave," he said, his voice low and strained. "The road, it wants you." Kat stared at him, fear and confusion swirling in her chest. "What are you talking about?" she managed to whisper. The man's eyes darkened. "Don't go back. Don't drive on the road again. It's too late for me, but you can still get away." Before she could respond, before she could even think of what to say, he was gone, disappearing into the fog like a ghost. Kat sat there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't know what was happening, but one thing was certain, something terrible was waiting for her on that road. And it wasn't just the man. The next morning, Kat woke with a sense of unease that had settled deep in her bones. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-eaten toast on her plate, her parents' chatter fading into the background. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the strange warning from the man outside her car the night before. Her parents were talking about their upcoming trip, just a short weekend drive to visit family in the next state over, but something about it made her stomach twist. They planned to take the very highway the man had warned her about, the same desolate stretch of road that now felt more menacing than ever. "You're quiet this morning," her mom said, giving her a concerned look over her cup of coffee. "You okay, honey?" Kat forced a smile, nodding. "Yeah, just tired." But she wasn't just tired, she was terrified. Something bad was going to happen, she could feel it in her gut. And as the day went on, that feeling only grew. By the time she left for campus in the late afternoon, Kat's hands were trembling as she gripped the steering wheel. She didn't want to take the highway. The man's words, "the road it wants you," echoed in her mind with every turn she made. Still, she had no other way to get to school. She had to face it. As she pulled onto the highway, her eyes scanned the trees on either side of the road, now more sinister in the fading daylight. The sky was dull and overcast, the shadows lengthening as the sun dipped toward the horizon. The road stretched ahead endlessly, but today, it felt narrower, as though it were closing in on her. Suddenly, the air inside the car grew cold, and Kat's breath hitched as the car lurched. The tires squealed on the pavement, and for a moment, she lost control of the wheel. The world outside blurred, as if the road itself was warping, twisting in front of her eyes. She slammed on the brakes, heart pounding as the car screeched to a stop. "What the hell?" she muttered, her fingers trembling on the steering wheel. The radio flickered, the static returning in full force. Beneath it, whispers rose again, louder now, like they were surrounding her. Her eyes darted to the rearview mirror, but there was nothing behind her except fog, slowly creeping across the road. She pressed the gas, willing the car forward. The road stretched out impossibly long before her, like it had no end. The fog thickened, swirling as if alive. Her pulse quickened. Was this what the man had warned her about? Was this the road's power? Kat's knuckles whitened as she gripped the steering wheel, eyes darting from the fog creeping across the road to the rearview mirror. The whispers in the static seemed to grow louder, clearer, as though they were calling her name. She fought to keep the car steady, but it felt like the road was working against her, bending her path, pulling her deeper into something she couldn't understand. Suddenly, movement in the fog caught her eye. A dark shape, barely visible in the murky air, stepped out onto the road. The man. He was standing in front of her, just as he had before, but now, he was closer, his eyes locked onto hers, his face pale and gaunt in the fog. She slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding in her chest. Kat rolled down the window just a crack, enough to hear him but still safe inside her car. "You shouldn't have come back," the man said, his voice low and strained. "I told you, the road." "I didn't have a choice," Kat snapped, her voice trembling. "What do you want from me? Why? Are you following me?" The man took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "I'm not the one you need to worry about. I'm trying to help you. The road, it's alive. It feeds off people like you, people who try to fight it. Once it has you in its grip, it doesn't let go." Her breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean? People like me?" The man's eyes darkened, and for the first time, Kat saw the weight of years, maybe decades, of suffering in his gaze. "I was like you once. I thought I could escape. But the more you fight it, the deeper it pulls you in. I'm trapped here, forever. The road has made me its servant." Kat felt a chill run down her spine. "You're lying." "I wish I were." He took another step forward. "But now it's too late for you. You're already part of it." Before she could respond, the static on the radio roared to life, and the man vanished into the fog. The road stretched out in front of her, an endless expanse of nothing. Kat gripped the wheel and pressed the gas, her heart racing. She had to get away. She had to figure out what was happening before it was too late. Kat drove for what felt like hours, the road endlessly stretching in front of her. The trees blurred past her windows, their dark shapes twisted in the fog. The static in the radio grew louder, the whispers rising and falling like waves, pulling her deeper into the road's grasp. Her eyes flicked to the dashboard. She should have reached her destination by now, but there were no familiar signs, no exits, no landmarks. It was as if the road had swallowed her whole, twisting time and space in ways that made no sense. And then she saw it, a faint glow in the distance, barely visible through the thickening fog. As she drew closer, the outline of buildings emerged from the mist, an old, decayed town that shouldn't be there. Kat slowed the car, her breath catching in her throat. The town was completely still, its buildings crumbling, windows shattered. The road led her straight into the heart of it, as though it had been waiting for her all along. She stopped the car in the middle of the street, the engine sputtering as if struggling against the oppressive air. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft hiss of the fog. Stepping out of the car, Kat felt the weight of the road pressing down on her. The air was thick, with something heavy, something dark, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She walked through the streets, her footsteps echoing off the dilapidated buildings. Every door was closed, every window dark. It felt like a ghost town, abandoned long ago, yet somehow still alive. And then she saw them, shadowy figures, barely visible through the mist, moving in and out of the buildings. They weren't human, not anymore. Their faces were blank, their movements slow and deliberate, as though they were stuck in an endless loop. Kat's heart pounded in her chest. She needed to get out of here. Kat turned to run back to her car, but the fog had thickened, swirling around her like a living thing. The road was no longer visible, swallowed by the mist. She was trapped. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the fog, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The figures were closer now, moving toward her with an eerie, silent purpose. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the dense air, her fear rising like bile in her throat. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shifted, and she stumbled. The fog parted for a brief moment, revealing the heart of the town, the old town hall, crumbling and half-collapsed, with something dark and pulsating at its center. Kat felt drawn to it, as though an invisible force was pulling her closer. The whispers in the air grew louder, more insistent, urging her forward. She had to see what was there. She had to know. Her feet moved of their own accord, carrying her toward the building. The figures were behind her now, closing in, but she barely noticed them. All she could focus on was the strange, pulsing object at the center of the wreckage. As Kat reached the town hall, she stopped, her heart pounding in her chest. The object in front of her was unlike anything she'd ever seen, a black, heart-like stone, pulsating with a dark energy that seemed to hum through the air. The ground around it was cracked and broken, as though the earth itself had been twisted and corrupted by its presence. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the stone. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her. Like a vortex. She knew, deep down, that this was the source of the road's power. The man's words echoed in her mind, "It's alive. It feeds off people like you." But before she could pull away, her hand brushed the stone, and a jolt of icy cold shot through her body. Her mind exploded with visions, flashes of people, places, faces twisted in terror as they were consumed by the road. She saw the town in its final moments, saw the people who had tried to escape, only to be swallowed by the darkness. And then she saw herself, standing on the side of the road, waiting for the next traveler. Kat jerked her hand back, gasping for breath. She stumbled away from the stone, her body trembling. The truth was undeniable now, she was part of the road. And there was no way out. The figures closed in around her, their hollow eyes staring through her, their voices a low murmur in the fog. The road had claimed her, just as it had claimed them. As the fog swallowed her whole, Kat realized with a sinking dread that she was no longer a victim. She was the watcher now. The fog was suffocating, so thick it felt like a living thing pressing down on Kat from all sides. She stood in the center of the abandoned town, her mind spinning, her heart racing. The vision of herself, standing on the side of the road, waiting for the next traveler, replayed over and over. In her head, The stone, its dark energy had revealed the truth. She wasn't just a victim. She was part of this now. Her breath hitched as she took a step back from the pulsating heart of the road. It was as though the ground beneath her feet was sinking, pulling her deeper into the earth. The road was alive, and it wasn't just trapping her, it was consuming her, slowly, piece by piece. Her body trembled as she turned away from the stone and looked around the decayed town. The shadows of the lost souls still moved between the crumbling buildings, their eyes hollow, their faces expressionless. They were trapped here, just like her. But she wasn't like them. Not yet. Kat's breath came in short, ragged bursts as she began walking toward her car, the mist swirling around her. The weight of the road felt heavier with every step, as if it was pulling her back, trying to stop her from leaving. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally in the silence, a reminder that she was utterly alone here. When she reached the car, her stomach dropped. The once familiar vehicle looked different. The doors were warped, and the windows were clouded over with grime. The paint was peeling, and rust spread across the hood like a disease. It was as if the road had begun to claim the car, just as it was claiming her. Still, she needed to leave. She had to try. She yanked open the driver's side door, the hinges, groaning in protest, and slid into the seat. Her fingers shook as she turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, choked, and then roared to life. But the moment of relief was short-lived. The static returned, filling the car with that now familiar hiss, and the whispers began. Again, louder this time, more insistent. Kat slammed the car into gear and hit the gas. The tires squealed as the car lurched forward, but the road beneath her seemed to resist, pulling her back. The fog closed in on all sides, so thick she could barely see the crumbling buildings disappearing behind her. The car groaned, struggling to move forward. But she wasn't going to give up. Not yet. The car jerked forward down the empty street, the fog thickening with every passing second. Kat could barely see the road in front of her, and she gripped the steering wheel tightly, willing the car to move faster, to get her out of this nightmare. But the road had other plans. As she drove, shadowy figures began to appear in the fog, lining the edges of the street. At first, they were just blurry shapes, indistinct in the mist. But as she got closer, she could see them. More clearly, people, or what had once been people. Their eyes were hollow, their faces pale, and expressionless, their bodies twisted by whatever the road had done to them. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized who they were. The lost souls, the victims of the road. These were the people who had been trapped here before her, people who had fought and failed to escape. And now they were part of the road's endless hunger, just like she would be if she didn't find a way out. Kat pressed the gas harder, but the car was sluggish, like it was moving through water. The figures on the side of the road didn't move, didn't react to her presence. They just watched, their empty eyes following her every move. A chill ran down her spine, and she fought the urge to look away. As she drove past them, one of the figures stepped out into the road. Kat slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. Her heart raced as she looked up at the figure standing in front of the car. It was a woman, her face gaunt, her clothes tattered. Her eyes were wide, filled with a terror that Kat recognized all too well. The woman raised a trembling hand and pointed toward the town hall. "You can't fight it," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the static. "It will take you, just like it took us." Kat's pulse quickened as the woman's words sank in. She couldn't let that happen. She couldn't end up like them, trapped forever, consumed by the road's hunger. She had to find a way out. The woman's hollow eyes locked onto Kat's, pleading, "Run, before it's too late." With a shaky breath, Kat nodded and hit the gas, swerving around the woman and speeding down the street. But as she drove, the figures in the fog seemed to grow closer, their presence suffocating. She was surrounded, and no matter how fast she drove, she couldn't escape them. The road wasn't just holding her, it was hunting her. Kat's hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles were white, her heart pounding in her chest. The fog swirled around her, and the road stretched on, endlessly. She couldn't see where It led, but she knew one thing: she had to get out. She had to escape the road before it consumed her completely. The figures of the lost souls still lined the edges of the street, watching her, their hollow eyes tracking her every move. But they didn't speak. They didn't try to stop her. They were simply waiting. Just like the man had been. Suddenly, out of the fog, the man appeared. He stood in the middle of the road, his face as gaunt as ever, his eyes dark and hollow. Kat slammed on the brakes again, the car screeching to a stop just feet away from him. For a moment, neither of them moved. The fog swirled around them, thick and oppressive, and the static in the car grew louder, filling the air with a relentless hiss. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and filled with something Kat hadn't heard before: resignation. "You're running, but it's no use." Kat glared at him, her chest heaving with the effort of holding back her panic. "I'm not like them," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "I won't let the road take me." The man's eyes darkened, and he shook his head slowly. "I said the same thing once. And now, look at me." He gestured to the lost souls standing in the fog, watching them both. "We all said it. But the road, it doesn't care what you want. It takes. That's all it knows how to do." Kat's breath hitched, but she refused to give in to the fear clawing at her chest. "Why are you here?" she demanded. "Why are you following me?" The man's expression softened, just for a moment. "Because I was like you once. I tried to fight it. I tried to escape. But the road, it doesn't let you go. And now, I'm part of it. I'm its servant, forced to lure people like you here. I can't stop it. But maybe you can." Kat's mind raced, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She could see the truth in his eyes, the years, decades of suffering that had worn him down, trapped him in this endless nightmare. And now, the road wanted to do the same to her. "I don't believe you," she said, her voice shaking. "There has to be a way out." The man took a step closer, his face grim. "The only way out is to stop running. The road feeds on your fear, your desperation. The more you fight it, the deeper it pulls you in. You have to face it." Kat's breath caught in her throat. Face it? How was she supposed to fight something like this? Something that wasn't even human? The man took another step toward her, his eyes locked onto hers. "The heart of the road. It's in the town. That's where it all began. That's where you have to go." Kat's heart raced as his words sunk in. The heart of the road. She had seen it, the pulsating stone in the town hall. That had to be the source of the road's power. If she could destroy it, maybe she could break free. But the man's expression darkened, and he shook his head slowly. "But remember this: once you confront it, there's no turning back. The road will never let you go." Kat sat in the driver's seat, her hands trembling as the man's words echoed in her mind. The heart of the road. She had to face it. She had to destroy it. But the thought of returning to that dark, pulsating stone filled her with dread. The static in the car grew louder, and the whispers rose to a fever pitch. The fog outside thickened, swirling around the car like a living thing. The road was closing in on her, pressing down, suffocating. Kat's heart pounded in her chest as she threw the car into reverse and backed up, her eyes locked on the town in the distance. She didn't have a choice. If she didn't face the heart of the road, she would become like the man, like the lost souls. Trapped forever. She pressed the gas, the car groaning as it lurched forward toward the town hall. The fog parted. Just enough for her to see the path ahead, the crumbling buildings looming over her like twisted, forgotten monuments. As she neared the heart of the town, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if the road itself was screaming for her to turn back. But she wouldn't. She couldn't. Her hands tightened on the wheel as she sped through the empty streets, the fog closing in behind her like a wave. The town hall appeared in the distance, its dark silhouette barely visible through the mist. And at its center, the heart of the road pulsed, waiting for her. She stopped the car in front of the building and stepped out, her heart pounding in her chest. The ground beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting with every step she took toward the town hall. The air was thick with something heavy, something dark. The road's hunger. Kat took a deep breath and forced herself to move forward. She had to do this. She had to face the road, no matter what it cost her. The town hall loomed before her, its decayed facade crumbling under the weight of time. Kat hesitated at the threshold, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The air around her buzzed with a dark energy, and she could feel the road's presence, its hunger, pressing down on her, pulling her in. Inside, the hall was dark and cold, the walls covered in dust and cobwebs. But at the center of the room, the stone pulsed with life, its black surface glistening in the faint light that seeped through the cracks in the walls. Kat's heart raced as she stepped closer, her eyes locked on the stone. This was it. The heart of the road. The source of its power. If she could destroy it, maybe, just maybe, she could break free. But as she reached out, her fingers just inches from the pulsating stone, a voice, cold and ancient, whispered her name. And she knew, with a sinking dread, that the road wasn't going to let her go. Kat stood at the threshold of the decaying town hall, her hand hovering just inches from the heartstone at the center of the room. It pulsed with dark energy, each beat filling the air with a low hum that vibrated through her bones. The whispers in the air were louder now, swirling around her like a vortex, calling her name in voices that weren't entirely human. She hesitated, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The stone seemed to beckon her, urging her to step closer, to touch it, but deep down, she knew that if she did, there would be no turning back. The road's grip had tightened around her the moment she had crossed into this cursed town, and now, it was waiting for her to make her final move. The fog outside pressed against the cracked windows, seeping in through the gaps in the walls. Like fingers reaching for her. The air was thick, heavy with something malevolent that she couldn't quite name. Kat shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as she took a tentative step back. But she couldn't leave. Not yet. Her gaze drifted around the room, taking in the dilapidated walls, the broken furniture, and the eerie stillness that filled the space. This place had once been alive, bustling with people who had made their homes here, but now it was nothing more than a tomb, a monument to those who had fallen victim to the road's endless hunger. Kat swallowed hard and forced herself to take another step forward. The whispers rose in intensity, and for a brief moment, she thought she could make out words, fragments of conversations, cries for help, and desperate pleas. They were the voices of the lost souls, trapped in this place, waiting for someone to free them. She couldn't let that happen to her. She couldn't end up like them. As Kat's eyes darted around the room, they landed on something she hadn't noticed before: a small, dusty journal sitting on a shelf in the corner, half buried beneath a layer of grime and debris. She approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest as she reached out to pick it up. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. She wiped the dust away with the sleeve of her jacket and opened it, the pages crackling as she turned them. The handwriting was old, spidery, and difficult to read, but she could make out enough of it to understand the horrific story unfolding in front of her. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Marsh, the founder of the town. His words told the tale of how the town had struck a terrible bargain with an ancient force that dwelled within the road. In exchange for prosperity and protection, the town had offered up the lives of travelers who passed through. They had lured them in, just like the man had tried to lure her, and the road had taken them, feeding off their fear and despair. But as the years went on, the road's hunger grew. It demanded more and more, until even the townspeople themselves were no longer safe. The town fell into ruin, consumed by the very thing they had tried to control. Kat's stomach turned as she read the final entry in the journal, written in a shaky hand. Elias had known what was coming. He had known that the road would take him, just as it had taken everyone else. His last words were a warning, a desperate plea for anyone who found the journal to leave before it was too late. But for Kat, it already was. The journal slipped from her fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing down on her as the weight of the road's history settled heavily on her shoulders. She could feel it now, the road's hunger, the insatiable need that drove it to consume everyone in its path. It was coming for her. Kat's head snapped up as the door creaked open, and the man stepped inside. He was gaunt, his face pale and drawn, his eyes hollow and filled with a sadness that made Kat's chest tighten. He didn't say a word as he approached, his footsteps slow and deliberate. For a moment, they just stood there, staring at each other. Kat could feel the tension between them, the unspoken understanding of what was happening. He had been trying to warn her, trying to stop her from going down this path, but it was too late now. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Kat clenched her fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. "I didn't have a choice." The man shook his head, his expression filled with a kind of hopelessness that made her heart ache. "None of us did. But you still have a chance." "A chance for what?" Kat snapped, her voice rising with frustration. "To end up like you. To be trapped here forever, just another victim of this cursed road?" He didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He had once been like her, desperate, scared, and determined to fight. But the road had taken him, just as it was taking her. And now, he was its servant, bound to it for eternity. Kat took a step forward, her hands trembling. "I'm going to stop this. I'm going to destroy it." The man's eyes darkened, and for the first time, she saw something else there: fear. "You can't," he said softly. "You'll only make it stronger." But Kat wasn't listening. She turned away from him and marched toward the Heartstone, her mind made up. She had to end this, no matter the cost. As Kat approached the Heartstone, the whispers rose to a deafening pitch, filling her head with voices, voices of the lost, voices of the damned. They cried out for help, for release, but beneath their pleas was something darker, something insidious. The road itself was speaking to her, taunting her, daring her to make her move. She reached out toward the stone, her hand trembling as her fingers brushed against its cold, smooth surface. The moment she touched it, a shock of icy cold shot through her body, and her mind exploded with visions, flashes of people, places, faces twisted in terror as they were consumed by the road. She saw the town in its final moments, saw the people who had tried to escape, only to be swallowed by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the road was trying to warn her, trying to stop her from going any further. But Kat didn't stop. She couldn't. She pressed her palm flat against the stone, gritting her teeth as the cold seeped into her bones. The stone pulsed beneath her hand, its dark energy thrumming through her veins. For a brief moment, she felt powerful, connected to something ancient and vast. But that power was a lie, a trap. The road wasn't giving her strength, it was taking her, absorbing her just as it had absorbed everyone else. Kat's breath came in short, shallow gasps as the ground beneath her began to shift. The room around her warped, the walls bending and twisting as if they were alive. The fog pressed in from all sides, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of screams. She was losing herself. The road was winning. As Kat approached the Heartstone, the whispers rose to a deafening pitch, filling her head with voices, voices of the lost, voices of the damned. They cried out for help, for release, but beneath their pleas was something darker, something insidious. The road itself was speaking to her, taunting her, daring her to make her move. She reached out toward the stone, her hand trembling as her fingers brushed against its cold, smooth surface. The moment she touched it, a shock of icy cold shot through her body, and her mind exploded with visions, flashes of people, places, faces twisted in terror as they were consumed by the road. She saw the town in its final moments, saw the people who had tried to escape, only to be swallowed by the darkness. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the road was trying to warn her, trying to stop her from going any further. But Kat didn't stop. She couldn't. She pressed her palm flat against the stone, gritting her teeth as the cold seeped into her bones. The stone pulsed beneath her hand, its dark energy thrumming through her veins. For a brief moment, she felt powerful, connected to something ancient and vast. But that power was a lie, a trap. The road wasn't giving her strength, it was taking her, absorbing her just as it had absorbed everyone else. Kat's breath came in short, Shallow gasps as the ground beneath her began to shift. The room around her warped, the walls bending and twisting as if they were alive. The fog pressed in from all sides, and the whispers turned into a cacophony of screams. She was losing herself. The road was winning. The road hadn't been destroyed. It couldn't be. It was too old, too powerful, too deeply rooted in the world. Kat had only done what the road had wanted her to do all along. She had taken her place within its cycle. Her body trembled as the truth settled over her like a suffocating blanket. She had become the new watcher, the new servant of the road. The man had been right. There was no escape, no way to fight it. The road didn't want her to destroy it, it wanted her to become part of it. Kat's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at her hands, now pale and gaunt, just like the man's had been. She could feel the road's energy pulsing through her, binding her to it forever. She was its new lure, its new servant, tasked with bringing in the next traveler. Her fate was sealed. Kat stood at the edge of the road, her hollow eyes watching as a car approached in the distance, its headlights cutting through the fading fog. The driver didn't see her yet, but they would. Soon, they would see her, just like she had seen the man. And just like her, they would think they could escape. But there was no escaping the road. There never had been.